You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Whenever a war breaks out, the devastating impacts on human lives are top of mind. Then we often look at infrastructure, critical roads and hospitals and schools damaged or destroyed. How destructive conflict is to the environment and to the climate hasn't been that well understood, even if it seems quite apparent. Today we look at the evidence that war is ruining our planet. Hello and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Jack Board. And hello to Liling coming in hot from Singapore HQ today. How are you?
Hello, Jack. I'm very good. Weekend is almost here, so I'm happy. How are you?
Yep, weekend's always here on a Thursday when the podcast is dropping. Yeah, I'm going well, yep. Now, you've been super busy, I know, from a lot of our WhatsApp correspondence. Frantic, stressed, overworked. It's really unfair, I think. But let's find out why. A lot of the work you're doing sort of as this super editor over there naturally revolves around the latest conflicts that are happening in the world. And listeners may not really know this about your regular work that you do beyond the podcast, but talk us through how you sort of coordinate all of this coverage of news in various corners of the world.
Wow. Okay. So my day job is as an editor at CNA's international desk. I cover several regions around the world, and it includes South Asia, so a lot of coverage over India and Pakistan. I also cover the Middle East, so what's happening in Gaza, for example. These are, of course, regions that are no stranger to conflict. And a lot of what I do is manage and steer coverage and guide our correspondents and stringers on what to cover. A lot of this is bad news that happens in war zones and flashpoints. So that's my day job.
So this kind of topic about conflict, I think, should be right down your alley. I think it's interesting as well to sort of get this insight into how an international newsroom works. And believe it or not, that was basically me doing that same type of role back in my Singapore days, 2013, 2014.
Oh, you were an editor.
Basically doing what you're doing right now.
Oh, wow. So what happened? You couldn't wait to get out of the newsroom and get into the field? Is that what happened?
Yeah, let me out.
Let me out of here.
Okay, quiz time to get us started this week. And do play along at home as well and see if you can do better than Liling this week. Now, today's a little tricky. It's a list of conflict climate events, scrambled out of order. So I want you to rearrange them chronologically based on when they occurred or when they began to emerge. So today we're talking a lot about how conflict and climate intersect. These are some of the prominent examples of that from around the world. Let's see how good your news history is if you can put them in the right order. Got it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, number one. Severe drought displaces over 1 million farmers in Syria, fueling rural-urban migration and social unrest that precedes civil war.
Syria. Okay.
Number two is Russia intensifies Arctic military presence amid warming seas and resource access routes opening due to ice melt.
Kola Peninsula. Is that what you're talking about?
Number three, Lake Chad shrinks by 90%, driving resource competition and aiding Boko Haram recruitment in the Sahel.
Okay.
And number four, prolonged droughts and desertification linked to climate change lead to a scarcity of arable land and water in Sudan, intensifying competition between nomadic herders and settled farmers, escalating into violent conflict.
Wow.
That's the best quiz you've ever had.
You have outdone yourself. That is probably the most brain pain you've ever inflicted on me here. Okay, so wait, just to go back. First option was Syria. And then second, Russia and Arctic ice. Third was Lake Chad. And fourth was Sudan.
You got it.
Okay.
Okay. Good luck. We'll have the answer at the end. Okay, it's time for our main story this week. Recently, what was labelled the first global study on the environmental impacts of armed conflict was released. It has some stark but maybe unsurprising findings. countries with an armed conflict have a significantly worse environmental performance, and it can take 3 decades post-war for recovery to take place. Wider ecological disruptions and impacts on soil, water, and air are something we often forget, but are so important.
Now, what was interesting from this research, which was published by the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, was that it started by discussing some past events known to be highly environmentally damaging, like Agent Orange used during the Vietnam War or the first Gulf War with the oil wells set on fire, the NATO strikes in Kosovo in the 1990s that damaged oil refineries and chemical plants and, of course, spewed pollutants and contaminants into the air, into the land, and into the sea as well.
Yeah, I think it's really useful to look back because these are examples right in front of us where we can see how the environment has been impacted by conflict. One aspect we may not think about much is the CO2 emissions from military activity itself. Now, if we look at Gaza, military operations there are estimated to have contributed substantial greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if we include future rebuilding efforts, whenever that may occur and however that looks, the conflict could end up causing the equivalent of 61 million tonnes of CO2. So that's more than the annual emissions of 135 individual nations. And that's according to researchers from the UK and the US. And this is ongoing, of course, and that report was done last year. Crazy numbers. Now, one expert told us at CNA that the global defence industry in general has this enormous greenhouse gas footprint, especially if you think about all of the industrial activities that are needed to make the weapons, to make the vehicles, etc. And then just the pure length of recovery from these conflicts was really striking to me. And quoting from the report, these emissions tend to remain high several years after large-scale armed conflicts, as the state needs to retain a robust military presence to deal with breakaway or newly emerging rebel groups or due to fears that international tensions will rise again. So once the war is over, it doesn't mean the emissions stop.
No, it doesn't. And a study a couple of years back estimated that war and military activities account for 5.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not sure to what extent 5.5% is still valid today, given the number of conflicts that we are facing now. But it's still nowhere near some of the major offenders like the transportation industry. But at least, with transportation, there's action to target it, to transition it to cleaner fuel. I think with war, it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, often this is not even being counted, right? I think military emissions are not even being counted under countries' contributions to climate change, right? It's just kind of a blank space.
Right. But also, wars don't just lead to climate change. Very often these wars are a result of the impact of climate change on critical resources and basic needs like food and water, for example. And that's what we saw, the droughts leading to a lot of conflicts in our lifetime. We talked about Syria. That's an example, right? So I think a big part of the conversation needs to be about how governments can work and get the support they need to avert and adapt to the effects of climate change across critical trigger areas like food and water security, address poverty, employment. And this, of course, leads to questions about money. The report finds that major international funding mechanisms often prioritize stability, and that makes sense, but it really limits the attention towards countries already unstable and highly exposed to conflicts, right? Countries that actually need the money most.
Right. So sure, well, why would you invest money in countries with a war that's going on or with institutions that don't work? That's really tricky.
Yes, and this report also calls on those who control the purse strings, from local authorities to national governments, international donors, to mobilize resources for dealing with conflict-related environmental damage. So, these are not just handouts. These are measures like reforestation, removing the toxic remains of war like munitions and chemicals, and rebuilding crucial environmental infrastructure. And the study points out that a green recovery is even more important in the wake of war. Developing sustainably is more important in the wake of war.
That money is a really central question. These rising global tensions too result in the growing deficits between the money that's needed for countries being hit by both conflict and climate change and what rich nations are willing to put on the table for that. And we know that climate change and conflict are closely intertwined. They're increasingly fueling one another, as you've just kind of spoken about. One security expert told me that resources and attention are being directed towards immediate survival instead of long-term adaptation strategies. And so that doesn't bode well, really, for climate impacts either.
So looking at the context of the major conflicts today, Gaza, of course, and then Ukraine, which is a war that stretches across vast amounts of territory. Even during the course of the conflict, we can see environmental impact unfolding. And you remember the Kakhovka, and I'm probably mispronouncing this, the Kakhovka dam explosion and collapse, and then the subsequent high levels of copper, arsenic, and oil contamination recorded in surrounding water bodies and soil, and the Russian drone attacks on the Ukrainian nuclear power plant. Earlier, I touched on contaminants in air, land, and sea from conflict. One of our colleagues, William Denslow, was just in Odessa, in Ukraine, by the Black Sea, speaking to a scientist about the maritime impacts being felt there.
Another victim of war, washed ashore. Scientist Ivan Urosev says dolphin carcasses like this have become an increasingly common sight on the Black Sea coast.
It's a really big stress to work when we hear bombing, when we saw drones, when we saw many dolphins, dead dolphins on the shoreline.
Tuvlivsky Limani National Nature Park's 44-kilometre sandbar and 13 estuaries are a haven for roughly 1 million migrating birds. It's a narrow strip of the Black Sea and the only park of its kind not under Russian occupation.
Inside of this big area we have strictly protected area.
Ivan has been studying the impact of the war on the park's wildlife. This grebe is lucky. Ivan says 30,000 such birds have died since December, following an oil spill caused by 2 Russian tankers in the Black Sea's Kerch Strait. And he blames Russia's drones for spooking flamingos, forcing them to abandon their nests and giving gulls the opportunity to decimate last year's colony.
The drones, they stay 1-2 minutes, but during this period, very aggressive gulls, yellow-legged gulls, they come to this colony and they destroyed all nests. 400 nests was destroyed fully by these gulls. 400.
While drones and missiles pose a threat from above, Ivan says mines and sonar are harming sea life.
Researchers estimate that since Russia's full-scale invasion, at least 80,000 dolphins here in the Black Sea have died as a direct result of the war. Those here say it's just one example of the environmental war crimes committed by Moscow.
So William Denslow reporting from Odessa there on the maritime impact of the Ukraine war.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and concerning report, and timely, given that this war still rages on, despite some signs of a potential ceasefire. Of course, that wasn't his full report. Go and check it out.
The story's been released. It's online, so look out. William Denslow, CNA, Black Sea, dying dolphins.
There's lots of other research as well that's looking at different aspects of this important topic. Something that caught my eye was findings by the International Monetary Fund back in 2023 that found that GDP losses from extreme weather events can be about 4 times higher in fragile and conflict-affected states compared to other countries. So then you start to see this double burden, that countries that are affected by conflict are also to a large degree highly exposed to climate change. Economically, it's going to have a much bigger impact on them if they're hit by some of these climate-driven events, which of course is making life for the populations in those countries incredibly difficult.
And we shouldn't forget, Jack, that there's precedent for the world to come together to create solutions, right? In periods of tensions, even if the world seems at odds with each other right now. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, I know we keep talking about that. It's a very boring title, but it's important because it is the process that the world uses to come up with climate agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Paris climate deal, and it was formed in the turbulent aftermath of the Cold War in the early 1990s. So climate has had that connection with global conflict in the past and the complications of political negotiations around trying to solve it.
Okay, back to our quiz question. We've been doing lots of talking. I don't know if you've had a lot of time for thinking.
No.
But at home, maybe you have. Can you rearrange these events chronologically based on when they occurred or began to emerge? 1 was the severe drought in Syria.
Okay.
2, Russia boosting military in the Arctic. 3, Lake Chad shrinking. And 4, Sudan's desertification.
Okay, Lake Chad, that's been going on for a long time. I think we're talking like 1970s, maybe even earlier. I know the drought in Sudan also dates back to around that time, or at least around the Darfur War. When was the Darfur War? When did it break out?
That was 2003, I believe.
Okay, so I'm going to go...
Big hints there.
So, yeah, you just did. So I'm going to go with timeline-wise, I'm going to go with Lake Chad first, because 90% can't happen like just overnight. And then I'm going to go with the Sudan one, because I think the Sudan one may not have started the war or led to the war, but I think it made it a lot worse. And then I'm going to go with Syria, because I know climate change resulted in a major food shortage and crop failures that led to the civil war. And then, I don't know much about the Russia Arctic thing, but I feel like that may have been more recent. So I'm going to go with that as last.
Well, you've absolutely nailed it. All correct.
No way.
Yeah, well done.
No way.
I knew somebody with an experience working on Africa and the Middle East would be able to get this right. Okay, so you had Lake Chad, significant drying that began in the 1960s. And what happened was it triggered this cascade of poverty, unemployment, that over a couple of generations by the 2000s really made these communities more vulnerable to extremist elements, and Boko Haram being quite an influential force in that part of the Sahel. Sudan, this is around the time of Darfur, which was 2003. We know some of the horrors that we saw in that country that was driven by this extended periods of drought and conflict that occurred. Syria, its worst drought on record occurred between 2006 and 2010, really devastated its agricultural systems, forced mass migration from rural areas to cities, all sorts of displacement, which then intensified existing social tensions and contributed then to the outbreak of civil war in 2011, which we're still seeing the remnants of today. And then, of course, Russia.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Russia's Arctic ambitions definitely have deep historical roots, but the melting of Arctic ice really sped up and expanded its militarization efforts around 2007, and you saw significant infrastructure, more forces building up, but that's sort of really intensified through the late 2010s and still to today. And we see the Arctic being a major climate conflict issue. And of course, everyone would have heard about Greenland and Trump's efforts to take over that part of Denmark. That's all linked to what's happening up there in the Arctic as ice melts.
Ah, okay. There we go. Context.
That's it for this episode of Climate Conversations. Thanks, as always, for joining us. Did you know, if you're listening on Spotify, that you can give us a rating and you can leave some comments? That would be really cool if you do.
Make our day. All right. Catch you again next week, Thursday. I'm Liling. Bye for now.
I'm Jack Board. Thanks as always to the team that put together this podcast: Saye Win, Tiffany Ang, Janani Jahari, and Crispina Roberts.